Righty. So we have talked about doing this episode, I think off and on I think it's been on the long list for over a year, but I think we've been sending information on it back and forth. We were just talking offline that I was like, gosh, I don't even know if I'm ready. Because as I looked in my messages and looked at everything, said the subject of this particular episode, uh, it was almost too many. Like it's been a subject for too long. So there was so many studies and articles and first person theorizing testimonials about this topic that it was almost overwhelming. And hilarious too, because this is actually a companion piece, much like we did the two episodes of like, is blank a social construct? This is actually a companion piece to an earlier episode of ours. And we're doing it, I don't even know, 6 months, 8 months later. But once again, as we've talked about openly, the ability of AI to helpfully summarize vast amounts of previous labor is, I continually say, like, this is I wouldn't say the undiscovered country, but I feel like it's a great net positive of having a digital assistant to basically hand a whole bunch of files to and be like, here, will you please put this into a presentation in summary, including all links for these things so I can synthesize, to which you have capably used Claude recently to do. And so I'm actually kind of excited to revisit it from at least some degree of naivete.
Yeah, and guiding Claude is best practice, right? And saying, especially such
Hmm.
a vast subject, saying, well, here are the kind of categories I'm intuitively, leaning into or curious about,
Yeah.
and yeah, absolutely, like organizing those, digging around a bit, finding research, that I probably wouldn't on my own. So I come to this surprisingly more researched than usual. That's
Yeah.
usually Brendan digging deep, spending many hours. Uh, and I think part of that, to be honest, was given the sensational, maybe even clickbaity topic here. This might be, I judge, the most likely one to go viral, just based on the title alone,
Hmm.
just because it's going to be provocative. And so I thought that was some good social pressure to inspire me to,
Hmm.
sit up straight, and have my ish together a little more. As I being Andy Swindler.
And I, Brendan McNamara.
And what is that clickbaity topic of the day
So
or
yeah, this
question?
is this is our companion piece. I think our last one would be controversial, but only in certain cohorts and actually very typical, maybe even cross-stitch activism level typical to make an inside joke that no one will get. Should we smash the matriarchy? So in many
Uh,
ways, this is part two. This is a companion piece to Should We Smash the Patriarchy, which we did many months ago. Uh, but I feel like this is the necessary follow-up question that anyone pursuing or even like putting the bumper sticker on their car of Smash the Patriarchy is, if we smash the patriarchy, the inference, and maybe I'm misreading, is let's replace it with a different archy, which could either be like a gender equality archy, which I'd probably be more prone towards. But I feel like often, and maybe even with a slight growth pattern, the inference seems to be let's replace that. Let's try a couple thousand years of matriarchy and see how that goes. And I think my theory is we're actually multiple decades into functionally what we would label a matriarchy. We've talked through this. We'll deal with glossary terms and clarifications on semantics as typical. But as we talked in the last one, strictly speaking, patriarchy just means father rule. So matriarchy just means mother rule. But in Common Congress, patriarchy really stands for any patriarchal normative or patriarchal statistical dominance, probably more than anything. Meaning that's from those who want most especially to smash the patriarchy, they're looking at the data and they're saying, look at men are ahead here, 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 and here. There's perhaps some leaps. I'm not saying everyone's doing this, but some are into those outcomes must be the product of discrimination or hierarchical supremacy encoded somehow systemically. If so, we have to look at that same data now and go, okay, well, do we have the same type of evidence to prove that a matriarchy exists? And the question becoming, wait, is this, we're already in the solution we've long since waited for, which could be very positive for Smash the Patriarchy people? Or are we simply repeating the same mistakes of the past and just swapping out the mate for the pate?
We love our Archies.
We do love Archies. Well, and that's a fascinating part of it too. I do think that is something I am not premised towards, but collectivist societies, which I may constitute the majority of human flourishing or even human systems, uh, are collectivist and very hierarchical. We can look at China and India as like the mass populate. I mean, that they account for an enormous part of the human population, and both of those societies tend strongly patriarchal, even in a very dominant sense, and also very collectivist, which I feel like, and you're more immersed in this world than I am, which I feel like the dominant left paradigm is seeking to sort of alter our consciousness into being more of a collectivist plutocracy. And I think the problem of the right being a more individualist oligarchy. So it's really it's a dispute over which oligarchy we're going to follow, really, in the modern sort of like socio-political schematic. Um, and I think this is just one tether of it, but it's a pretty decent like umbrella term that gets thrown around that could be helpful in terms of analysis. I mean,
Yeah. So gosh, even just in my relatively brief interactions with Claude, we
yeah.
created a glossary of, I don't know, a dozen terms. Um, Maybe a couple of those are worth pulling out. There's also
Hmm.
just a general framing to try to wrap our arms around, obviously, an extraordinarily multidimensional topic.
Yes.
So I could start there just with three framings that emerged. Um,
Hmm.
the narrow claim that women hold formal power over men in specific institutions,
Mm-hmm.
family courts, HR, Title IX offices, DEI programs, and exercise it punitively or unfairly. A structural claim that cultural and social norms now systemically favor women's interests, comfort, or narratives across multiple domains: education, health messaging, media sympathy, even without formal power. And historical claim that human societies were matriarchal in that women held political and economic dominance over men for most of prehistory, and patriarchy is a comparatively recent invasion, the
Mm.
framing at the heart of the book Before War, which I specifically asked Claude to look into. I've not yet read it, but I did read the book. A lot of it, I think, was based on The Dawn of Everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things I got out of reading The Dawn of Everything was that, their main argument was people talk about the agricultural revolution and 10,000 years ago as this just human idea, right? We
Yeah.
apply humanity in a worldly concept to periods where there weren't nearly as many people and they weren't organized enough to sort of all be
Yeah.
one thing. And I mean,
Yes.
they
Yeah.
aren't now really either,
No.
even
No.
though we can all sort of talk to each other. Um, so yeah, I want to caveat that and say, well, I haven't read the book, but I have at least one friend who is really, really, convinced that it's true. But there's a lot of controversy around that, and academic controversy around the idea that 6,000 years ago there was sort of this matriarchal utopia, and one of the main distinctions is a semantic one that falls out of that, which is the
Hmm.
difference between matriarchal, uh, which in Claude's definition, a kinship system where descent, inheritance, and clan membership pass through. Oh, I'm sorry. It's funny. It's funny it put them in this order. Actually, it put matrilineal first.
Yeah,
So
I think in normal academics, that's well. This is this is the broad difference between cultural use and academic use, which is, oh my gosh, that ends up in every single one of our conversations. But this is a good distinction. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'll start with matriarchal because that's where we're talking, and then I already gave it up. Matrilineal is the other one.
How dare you?
Matriarchal, a society in which women hold political, legal, or coercive power over men, structurally paralleling patriarchy, but reversed.
Yeah.
It's like reverse patriarchy.
Yeah.
No confirmed historical example exists at societal scale per mainstream anthropology as distinct from matrilineal societies, which are real and documented.
Yeah. And
Matrilineal being a kinship system where descent, inheritance, and clan membership pass through the mother's line rather than the father's. Historically well documented, uh, Indonesia, the Iroquois Confederacy, distinct from matriarchal.
yeah, yeah. Well, I don't even say, and this might just be like a socialism, truism, as opposed to something that's true, so my Jewish friends can correct me, but that uh, Judaism, like the kinship in the clan of Jews, is
Hmm.
matrilineal, meaning
Right.
like it passes through the mother, which is even part of sort of Christian doctrine as well. Whereas like the Messiah, the Mashiach, was born of a Jewish woman physically and sort of supernaturally inseminated, um, meaning like his entrance as a member of the Jewish tribe needed to essentially pass through the woman. Just as I would say, actually, most societies that venerate, I feel like most societies venerate women in the typical fashion in which they venerate women, which can vary and be like favorable and unfavorable depending on your perspective, but tend to favor women for their, actually, both men and women, for their specific gender roles, meaning the male is the begetter. This is my gender research, right? The gen is begetting or birthing. And so, like, the birthing is so much more, it's just practical, is so much more confirmable than begetting because people aren't usually gathered around for the insemination period, but they are often, there's especially in most societies in the world for most of human history, there is a community organization around birth. It would be atypical for no one else to be present at a birth, certainly in a post-agricultural sense, because the community, especially of other women most dominantly, come around and observe and witness. So there are multiple witnesses of, yes, this baby came out of this member of our tribe. Now, who helped put that baby there? I don't, we think it's the husband, we think it's this guy, we think it's that guy, but we don't really know. So it makes a lot of sense. And this is why women's virginity was also probably more heavily focused on throughout patriarchal societies because it's the essential, it's the this it's we're arguing about it in our country now, the birthright citizenship. Like, who did you come out of and where? Because you're like, we don't know where your origin point came from in terms of your life. Because again, unless you're in a public sex show. Uh, it was not witnessed, and of course, the act of conception is typically, or I would say almost universally, unwitnessed. But the act of birth is a confirmable event. Yeah, I don't. I looked too, and I can't find any matriarchy, any strong evidence of matriarchy ever existing. Um, so that to me has been fascinating, and especially around, again, a lot of my gender-based research originates in indigenous wisdom coming 6,000 years ago from the PIE, the Indo-European PIE. Sorry, pi. It's always weird to say pi in all capitals. Who doesn't love pi? But it's similarly timed. So in some ways, this relates to a lot of stuff we've talked about in terms of like new dictionaries and semantic override and sort of like manipulative linguistics from a negative point of view, is that just we established language, or we formally established language to protect patriarchal normativity, is a at least in my field of people that I argue with, is I would say a not infrequently invoked presupposition, but I can't see much evidence for it. Like, it seems more of like a speculative, like former utopia, kind of a Garden of Eden concept.
It is to expand on again a summary of before war, that
Yeah,
for about 200,000 years before the Bronze Age, that we were human societies were largely matrilineal and egalitarian. Paternity was socially irrelevant, as you just
yeah,
pointed out. Uh, Resources were shared communally, and violence was rare. And this, yeah, I think, as you just mentioned, the book frames the Indo-European expansion beginning around 3500 BCE as the point where patriarchal, hierarchical, marriage-based social structures were imposed largely through conquest. On this account, marriage itself, as an institution of paternity certainty and female control, is a comparatively recent invention, roughly 6,000 years old, layered onto a much older norm of communal mother-centered kinship.
Yeah. Well, that to me is the wildly speculative aspect because then there's this very certain of like, this is what history was like. We have very little evidence for it. And then we're saying there's no war, which really isn't. I mean, we have enough evidence of broken bones and smashed things. We have battlefield remnants from before that historically because we know how long like societies have been organized or agrarian. But the problem being, once you already reach 6,000 years ago, information is extremely limited. So you're having to make very speculative leaps based on very small sample sizes of, let's say, battlefield bones. So the idea, now granted, we also, the fascinating thing of like, even if that did exist, it still becomes a trade-off of, okay, well, to look at it from a modern like queer theory perspective, that would be like a major epoch of social queering, which says we question norms. So the norms was matriarchal. We adamantly question norms and we reversed sequence. My speculation is that premise, which I feel like is a little weak, is what is being formally invoked in a historical, like broad scheme sense. As for now, why we are like why queer and queering has become a dominant sort of identity or even overarching identity for those who wish to overturn social norms. Now, my theory, of course, is that they're actually fully functioning within present day social norms. So I find that sort of curious and inexplicable, unless they're saying we're joining what happened, started many decades ago, maybe 100 years ago, and has now reached dominance decades ago, which is why we see amongst, I would say, the progressive left, we see a frequent invocation of what is socially normative, like like Christians. For I've had this conversation with many people recently that like I think I've said it on air. I'll say it again because it's controversial. All Christians, that's right with a W, all Christians are queer, meaning in the academic sense, queer doesn't mean gay. Queer means sort of questioning of normatively questioning, most essentially. Christians in the Bible, it literally says, "Be not conformed to this world." So Christians are adamantly uh, like contrary to and questioning of norms. Whereas I would say the average queer person in 2026 is actually typically aggressively into expanding social norms and making them more and more boilerplate and more into like social mores that we will establish as the kind of new social order. So that's in some ways that would be like the first major queering of society if that was true. And now we're going through queering part two, where we're gonna then we flip that norm. So then the question becomes: does queering societies on that level work functionally to produce like net benefit? So has patriarchy produced net benefit? And the examples are strong. Now the drawbacks are probably more often highlighted and also strong. But in terms of human flourishing, on the scale of which human flourishing has been gained, is astronomical. Like when you look at glass half full in terms of like where we're at now, whereas where we were 6,000 years ago, it's it's if you just look at the good list we could list for the next 6 hours of the mortality rates, maternal mortality, the longevity of life, the diseases that have been eradicated. I mean, just the invention of within the patriarchy of modern sanitation practices in medicine, arguably one of the most significant achievements humankind has ever discovered. Like the ability to go, oh, look at look at all the ways in which we died of various forms of sepsis, and you don't have to.
Well, one of the questions that kind of comparison always raises for me is just, I mean, it's funny. We were just talking about right before this, right? Being off of our phones.
Yeah,
You got out in nature, and
yeah,
then your phone broke, and it sort of felt like a strange blessing. Not exactly your words, but that's how I heard you.
yeah,
And and maybe even stranger to come back to the Matrix. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know how you compare a world with 8 billion people to much smaller agrarian
Yeah.
villages and clans, you know. And I don't know. I'd love to romanticize stuff like that. It sounds lots of things about it sound really groovy.
Hmm.
And it's always the whole premise of our show. It's always worth a conversation. Like, oh, were there things about that we shouldn't have left behind? Maybe we did leave behind that we shouldn't have left behind. Can we reintegrate? Like, those are all totally worthwhile conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the problem here being like, did they even exist? Or are we just speculating on what we would imagine they would be like? I think a little bit of it is the dances with wolves effect, which is this sort of like the noble savage trope, which is that somehow like those who existed long, long ago really had it all figured out. But the weird part is only when we started writing stuff down, so everything we really have pretty documented, that's all the bad stuff. And so the good stuff existed before we documented anything is very unusual. Like that to me is very unusual. Whereas I think we tentatively are actually entering the attempt of the first global queering at all, which can, for people who are trying to queer society, like that might be even all the more exciting. As opposed to a return to utopia, it's the introduction of a utopia. And we're both born in the United States of America, so I think utopic or utopian Shangri-La envisioning is pretty baked into our like desire. You know, I think the
Right.
American dream is built on like how do we build a new utopia that is, in many ways, hilariously contrary to classical hierarchies. Like we reject this whole idea of like the divine right to rule by virtue of caste, class, blah blah blah, anything, identity. My question is, do we both generally agree that at least in the cultural, not academic sense, that we are existing in arguably the, if not a matriarchy, the most matriarchal era that either one of us has existed in, or maybe even that the globe, the earth has existed in terms of documented history?
Well, one story I'll weave in.
Yeah.
A couple weeks ago, I was at Spiritual Unity of the Tribes
Hmm.
at of all things, a Boy Scout camp a couple hours west of here.
Cute.
Really beautiful. I don't know, when you get to Western Illinois, the landscape gets a lot more interesting actually, because it's the southern tip of the driftless region, where the
Mm.
like glaciers didn't flatten everything.
Mm.
And it was an extraordinary gathering. I guess it's gatherings of this kind centering from the Lakotas in one of the Dakotas. I can never remember which one. Uh, have been going on since I think 1989, and they've kind of been, I mean, in
Hmm.
a capitalist sense, almost like franchising and building out
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
these meetings where different tribes come together, but then they also invite, I don't know, non Turtle Island indigenous folks. And the premise there is refreshing, and I think it even parallels some of the things we've talked about. And the whole idea is, we were all part of a tribe
Yep.
at some point,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and still are, if you especially stretch it out to the unity of humanity. And the folks who invited me were Baha'i, and there were a few Baha'is there, and that's kind of their deal. But a couple things. One is this was the third year. I hope they keep doing it. It really was a beautiful gathering, mostly anchored in Lakota traditions, which I recently understand is one of the sort of four surviving, if not thriving in some ways, American Indian, Native American, take your pick,
Hmm.
uh, tribes that are still carrying on the traditions. Obviously, many, to your point, because they weren't written down, and they
Yep.
were largely obliterated. And it's funny, this touches on so many things, like including we've talked about cultural appropriation. I'd like to think we've
Yeah.
talked about everything, but I don't know. Because when I did Mankind Project in 2018, which was a really powerful men's program, uh, there was we didn't call it a sweat lodge because that would have been like stepping across the line of appropriation, but it
Okay.
was a sweat, I don't, basically the same thing,
Yeah.
led by a group of lodge keepers. And it was apparently gifted by the Lakota a few decades ago, or at least one Lakota elder. But I guess lots of things in Mankind Project came up for review in the last few years and have been pretty much reinvented. And they did away with the full sweat, I guess, because the lodge keepers had apparently, they would learn little new bits and pieces of wisdom and sort of bring them in an unsanctioned way and et cetera. So
Okay.
anyway, when I get to this, the very first thing I do is a sweat lodge led by a Lakota elder. And the question is, have you ever done a sweat lodge before? And I'm like, I really don't know how to answer that question because
Hmm.
yes, in a sense, I've
Yeah.
been in this structure, I've done this thing. It was led by people who were trained by your people. Um, and but I end up saying no, just in the sense, at least in saying no, I don't assume I know exactly what this is going to be. And it was
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
beautiful. The point of this being two things. One is I felt it was amazing. I just felt super included. The prime sort of main Lakota elder, a man, he even said like 40 years ago we wouldn't have invited you all in, you more or less European white people.
Yeah.
Uh, but we want to share this medicine. You need it. Um, and so I was really grateful for that. I was only there for 24 hours, and I want to go
Mm.
longer next year. Um, but the other thing, more relevant so a couple things I think that are coming up for me relevant to this show, which is on the one hand, this was the closest probably I've ever tapped in to like a local indigenous, culture, the Lakota. But it's so funny, I get to know this Lakota elder, and he's just like, oh yeah, I'm like an archaeologist for an energy company and all this. So it's
Whoa.
I don't know, it defied sort of what I really wanted going in there was to humanize it. It's to say, okay, I've got all these different stories about what these people are, and
Yes.
like we were just talking about, like, is it the noble savage? Do we elevate them? Do we diminish them? Do we pamper them in a sort of, I don't know, almost like social justice warrior way? Like, is it, and I didn't want it to be any of those things. I just wanted it to be an actual real relationship.
Yeah. Just be them.
And I just was, and it was so beautiful and welcoming and warm, and got to do like different workshops and different be with the sacred fire. But the other thing I think that's even more germane to this episode is that all there were elder women there, certainly, but every ritual, like the morning ritual with the sacred fire, the well, okay. In fairness, the sweat lodges there were male and female, so there was a woman leading the other sweat lodge. But
Hmm.
obviously, I was in the male one. Uh, and but then there were a number of other ceremonies, like whole group ceremonies, wiping of the tears, water, and for the most part, those were led by men. Although it's really funny in this moment as I'm describing this, I'm realizing my bias because I wanted to say like, well, look, I mean, most like there was clearly like a male elder wisdom keeper here that kind of ran the show. And I think that was more or less true in this case.
Hmm.
And they balanced it because there was like a water ceremony where we combined waters from around the world, and it was all women leading that. So
Hmm.
it's
Yep.
funny, I'm noticing my bias even as I'm telling this long story and saying, yes, and actually this might tease into one other piece, which is actually it weirdly bridges us maybe into like corporate America, but uh that I don't know, the idea that I want to believe I tasted some elements of what we want to believe was this, I don't know, utopian, connected, communal, relational society. Um,
Yeah.
and the thing that may bridge us is like, in some of the evidence in modern America, especially in corporate America, also venture funded startups, which we both agree is kind of a funny small side class of entrepreneurial, business work.
Yeah.
Uh, in many cases, the upper crust. of CEO positions and sort of major corporations, et
Yeah.
cetera, is male. So while women have certainly made enormous progress in the last several decades of taking on major positions in companies, there's still pretty few in that absolute upper layer of CEO, at least in the major corporations.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, what's interesting is that what is it? That sort of like continual theme pervades. And then the, I guess, contrary, which you looked up a ton of, you actually might even have more than I do today, where women dominate general hiring now. They dominate education now. The gender pay gap is less than 1 cent when confounders are controlled. Um, we have this strange thing where yes, I would say the whatever the elite strata is still seems to be statistically dominated by men. Some almost like a 75-25 or 70-30 ratio from what I've seen. Um, so pretty like a significant increase, but across general society, meaning like where most people live, um, the like women now dominate modern society, which I think is fascinating. So then it becomes, yeah, do we live in a functional matriarchy under a patriarchal uh, elite governance? Is kind of interesting of where we're at now, because women dominate. Gosh, I'm sorry, I'm trying to search for it while I had it all. There we go. Women earn a clear majority of post-secondary degrees, graduate from college at higher rates, are substantially more educated than employed men, constitute the majority of broad professional employment, period, constitute the majority of medical students and medical trainees, have near pay parity in at least one detailed matched worker compensation data set, and they receive a hiring preference in some controlled experiments and occupational settings, and enjoy earning superiority over young men in metropolitan labor markets. Meaning, socioeconomically, broadly speaking, and this is interesting, this is actually similar to how like male and female IQs distribute, which is like the general women, this is sort of like women are smarter than men trope. Women's median, I believe, is like the median is higher than men's median, but men dominate the bottom and the top. So there are like way more male geniuses than female geniuses. But if you just grab the random sample of men or women, you're more likely to grab a woman who's more intelligent than a man, which is pretty fascinating and actually starts to set up an understanding of why collectivist hierarchies would be male dominated, because then the general collective is already sort of being governed by women. So then the outliers, which are going to statistically, just in terms of IQ, it's just one like variable, we can look at tons, would tend to cluster around men, so that men would dominate the council of elders, let's say, for example, 7 men, 3 women, or something like that. And then women would functionally run society, which is sort of, at least in our era, has been the joke since the 1950s, that like the quote, who really wears the pants in this family? Um, well, you better ask your mother. Henpecked men in comedy, and men being angry, from the honeymooners to King of Queens and everybody loves Raymond or whatever. Like our social tropes generally posit that female dominated households or a social order is absolutely typical. And men are generally kind of slightly doltish. And when they dominate, it's like a little cringe, even in our own households. Like when dad kind of like exercises dad privilege, it's sort of like an eye roll. Oh boy, here we go. Like it's somehow some like played out schematic. So I think that's what's fascinating to me, is having grown up that way, that now 40 something years later, that's still the eye roll. And you're like, that's an old trope. And that's not that's not the world we function or live in. Unless I've missed multiple reversals but I haven't, at least in terms of, but again, most of my, how I look at the world is heavily influenced by a little bit by academics lately, but for most of my life through what's the pop cultural milieu. And the pop cultural milieu is dominantly controlled in similar ways by a particular cultural vantage point. we've talked about this a ton, that like we are run we are, progressives have the highest rate of disproportionate political power, socio-political power relative to their size in the world, partially because they run social order indicators. This is academia. This is HR. This is they sort of set the tone for what social mores are, at least in our generation. Now, maybe for like our grandparents or whatever, maybe it was very different. That men kind of said what's right and what's wrong. But we kind of live in an aggressive time of not only do they not, but in some ways it's sort of seen as morally suspect um, if they do. So it
Yeah.
is fascinating to look through those societies. Well, and the fascinating thing too, which we talk about all the time, and it has to come up here because we're literally talking about gendered hierarchies, is Lakota, Ojibwe, whatever, like at least for all recorded history that we know, like genders are essentially known and essential to establishing social order. Birthers or begetters, like, is our fundamental thing. So we live in a fascinating era where, in some ways, we're trying to smash the patriarchy and then smash even any reality around patri or matri existing as anything other than a dominance concept, which I think cleaves us to the historical claim, which is like these concepts didn't exist, except it was a matriarchy. So if it was a matriarchy, then it was still a gendered hierarchy, folks. Um, and if gender doesn't exist, then patriarchy doesn't exist and matriarchy doesn't exist. So we kind of have this is what makes it so fascinating. There's like all this activism sort of heading at direct cross purposes. Because if there is no woman, then there is no sacred mother. There is no woman. There is no man.
You would somehow be choosing leadership completely independent of
Yeah,
gender.
independent. Well, yeah. Well, and saying gender doesn't even exist really. Gender only exists in the mind. Gender is only a state of mind. So sex or reproductive capacity is not really stable enough to even be anything other than a power seizure. So now that kind of becomes the analysis problem that you were sort of struggling with, and I struggle with too, which is like, wait a second, am I falling into the trap that basically everything is a power game? And you're kind of looking for the power dynamics in anything. You're like, oh wait, who's
Mm,
in the room where it happens? To take it to Hamilton.
yeah. Well, a couple pieces fall out of that for me. One is this, I've heard it said a few times over the last few years, like that the mom is the CEO of the family.
Yeah.
And I didn't actually pull this up in the recent research, but I think it's pretty clear. I think there's good research around this. And, I'm actually doing a lot of research right now for my startup about with
Oh yeah.
couples, asking,
Hmm.
interviewing couples directly, 82 so far, including us. We just had somebody interview us.
Oh, very cool.
Um, and it's pretty clear, maybe especially when we talk to, therapists, assuming some reasonable bias, that the balance of who does more household chores tends to lean towards women, I think for all kinds of reasons. Uh, but that leads me to, I think we should have a conversation about that,
Hmm.
and
Yeah,
just
yeah,
every household should, like, what are we doing? Why are we doing
yeah,
it, etc.
yeah,
Let's have agreements. Let's base everything, on adult agreements.
yeah,
You know what? They don't have to be adult agreements, any kind of agreements. Get
yeah,
your children involved. But I
yeah.
want
Oh,
to, you know, transition this into actually talking about how boys and men are suffering, because I think
mhm.
that is what often gets overlooked. To your point, that's a great segue.
Yes.
When we look only at power, it makes it really easy to ignore the suffering. So this was in two categories, high level, boys in education, and then men's health and, I hadn't heard this term, deaths of despair.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, so one on the boys in education, I was again curious because I kind of had some awareness of this at a high level. But the average US boy at age 5 is measurably less, quote, school ready than the average girl. A
Mhm.
gap researchers link partly to slower early brain development, and it persists. Girls outperform boys in reading by more than 40% of a grade level in every US state. Um, boys receive a large majority of school suspensions. But this is the one that really stood out, I think, to both of us. In 1972, when Title IX passed, men earned about 56% of bachelor's degrees. Today, women earn roughly 58%. So it's a full
Yeah.
reversal,
Yeah. It's fascinating.
a wider gap in the other direction. But yeah, we don't hear about that much, nor is it in the, I don't know, it's not in the water yet. We're
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
kind of in the old story. So I think there's a pattern here, maybe of there was a genuine gap. We
Yep.
corrected it. Maybe we've overcorrected it, but the stories are passed down generationally. And I think that has a lot to do with just our interpersonal struggles and pain. And
Hmm.
I'm not saying this is the whole reason. It doesn't like mean there's no truth here. This is a very complex matter. And it's common, maybe even natural, to want to be seen and want to outsource or involve something or to justify like why we're struggling.
Yeah. Sure.
So I'll point out the one with men's health and these deaths of despair, that men die of suicide, drug overdose, and alcohol-related causes, quote, deaths of despair, at nearly 3 times the rate of women in the US.
Yeah.
Men account for roughly 3 out of 4 deaths of despair overall. And since 1979, actually pretty much the entire time you and I have been alive,
Yeah.
most men's inflation-adjusted wages have fallen while women's have risen.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as
And
I've said
and
before,
yeah.
like I was born into a feminist society and I live in a feminist society now. And it's funny too, because you'll see different people weaponize those same statistics differently, meaning some people will be talk about it how this is how toxic patriarchy harms men. That you see, they're like, see, men are harmed by patriarchy too. However, my theorem is like, no, no, no. This is the effect of toxic matriarchy that we're existing under. So this is how men are ending. This is the conclusion of we are now flipping the archy, and now this is how men are. This is the statistical outcome for men. Now, men have always died more, just because they're more expendable, and they're more frequently soldiers, and they go to war and that sort of thing, and so then they're more likely to gain injury. Men are also tend to be a little bit more physically impulsive as a statistical tendency. So that's always, to some degree, that's always existed. But to show how it has been exacerbated, and it's fascinating too, because it points to the same thing we've talked about, where we're talking about like anti-racist racial discrimination was necessary to correct racist discrimination outcomes. But then the question always is, okay, but when are we done? So my question is like, why weren't we done when it hit 50? Like, why did it go from 52 to 56 or whatever it was before, now to 58? So now the gap is wider favoring women. Like, shouldn't we have stopped uh, shouldn't Title IX have been done? We were just talking about this too, like how many states haven't ratified the like equal sex amendment or whatever, which may never occur now because whether sex exists or not, because anytime if gender exists, then doesn't exist, then sex doesn't exist, because sex is actually a category within gender, um, or it's a later adaptation, and a specificity. Or in many ways, this is cool. Sexus in Latin means a dividing line. So sex is simply clarifying the dividing line between begetting and birthing, which is what gender is, like kind by begetting and birthing. And so it's a fast. This is why I think looking at toxic matriarchy, or should we smash the matriarchy, is because I would posit that's functionally what most of us, if not all of us, live under presently. That we really don't we don't we have very little interaction with patriarchy on a human basis. Like in that when you're talking about being in the sweat lodge, being in the here and now, when you look at it experientially, like the number of people who kind of function under a patriarchal center is uh, infinitesimal. Like I know a strong cohort who does. I know a lot of people who are part of this guy Doug Wilson, who's probably one of the more well-known social like advocates for like full-on open intentional patriarchy in the U.S. anyway. He has a series of churches, and I know some people left my parents' church to go join his church regionally. And certainly in that schematic, you're going to find like a high proponent of patriarchy advocates. But that is literally like a subset of a subset of a subset of a subset of of the Christian community, which already I think most people would assume is patriarchal. That's functionally not really the case. Um, it might be heading there. We'll see. But it isn't now, nor has it in my lifetime. So I think that's the fascinating thing is we have this thing where I'm missing, in some ways, like the most central, like truth adjudication, which is lived experience. So my lived experience of reality in the West is not patriarchal at all. I mean, there's the fact that almost nobody knows the word misandry is good evidence of this, or that the word mansplaining exists. And the word mansplaining was coined when women were already dominating education, medicine, science. You know what I mean? That you're just like, hold on a second. Like, and general, I mean, to this point, general employment, general professional employment. And looking at
And
therapy,
sometimes I actually know the answer. Yeah.
yeah, I do. I know, right? Just because I'm a man, like, doesn't. So, but this is an interesting thing of like how, and if you talk to AI about this, I don't know if Claude did this with you, it speaks from a smash the matriarchy POV, generally speaking. So it'll list toxic patriarchy things and be like, well, patriarchy is toxic in these overt ways that we can tell. Whereas toxic matriarchy tends to be soft power. It's not so much that, it's this. And I was like, that's a really, and I looked at the list that it generated. I was like, dude, swap the list. Sometimes I gender my AI. I was like, swap the list and it functions for both. It's the same thing. We're doing the same
Right.
thing. There's just different highlights in sort of how it functions. But I know as a man, my lived experience is that my voice as a man is and not, I wouldn't say dump. It's not just dismissed because I'm a man, although I've been dismissed specifically because I'm a man dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of times in my life, specifically stated out loud specifically. Um, so my lived experience says that I don't, when people are like, smash the patriarchy, I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, you just mean like kill all the remnants of it? Like, are we rounding up the tribes and destroying them? And it's a fascinating thing, too, to then essentially draw on pre indigenous wisdom that may or may not exist as a justification for ignoring, let's say, indigenous wisdom, which, at least for all recorded history, we know like patriarchy was kind of the assumed norm. And I'm all for questioning that. My goodness gracious. Again, I grew up as a feminist, founding member of the feminist club in my high school. I've trotted out my CV on here many times. Um, but also being part of that movement, I was like, well, why aren't we celebrating? Like, why aren't we celebrating the fact that like all these things have been achieved? And I've talked to many people, feminists and all sorts of people who their lived experience tells them different. But when your lived experience matches like statistical reality, you kind of have a pretty decent basis of like, oh, okay, I have a pretty good perception. But when your lived experience contradicts empirical reality, you have to go, well, like, are you suffering from essentially like a socio-interpretive placebo effect, which may or may not be taking place here?
Well, yeah. So that kind of builds on this idea that I like the way you just put it, right? If our lived experience matches sort of a statistical reality, which is often, I think, the balance. It's funny, I'm the one here sort of citing this stuff from Claude. It's usually
Yeah,
often the other way
that's
around. We
yeah,
both
yeah,
share
yeah,
stories, but you're the one,
yeah,
more the researcher. Uh, and yeah, like that's sort of like keeps beckoning to me, this idea that at an interpersonal level, like, or just at a personal level, if I'm having a certain experience, maybe especially if it doesn't seem to match the statistical reality, I might get louder about that. I
yeah,
want my experience to be seen. I want to be healed,
yeah,
uh, and if we're, I don't know if, healed is a state, right? Like a destination. I think we talked about that before. But if I'm engaged in a practice of healing, especially if I've been really wounded in some way, which leads us
yeah,
to the other side. I talked about men, the challenges men face broadly, statistically.
yeah,
And this may just be obvious. I know we've said it before, but for women, the rates of intimate partner violence and sexual assault remain overwhelmingly asymmetric by victim sex and political representation at the top. um, national legislations, heads of state remaining heavily male globally. That's actually a funny, slightly strange things to conflate there. But I wanted to focus more on the sexual assault and violence. In other episodes, you've even gone as far as to say women are the most oppressed group throughout maybe human
I
history.
mean, yeah, historically speaking, I think it's a very legitimate claim.
So, and that's sort of, I would say, it seems more obvious. I don't know, like we may witness it more, we may hear about it more, like
Yep.
violence against women. So I'm noticing sort of a strange, in that you were saying toxic masculinity may be sort of more obvious, and
Yeah.
toxic uh, matriarchy may be more subtle,
Yeah.
but then the harm to women may be more obvious and the harm to men more subtle. And we could pick that apart in countless ways, but that's a funny parallel I'm noticing here.
Hmm. Yeah, it is pretty fascinating. Well, and maybe I can find it in time, but who knows? Uh, the rates of domestic partner violence are pretty close to equal, but the criminal levels or the ones that end up adjudicated, and this can a lot of it is distributed by like body mass and strength differentials.
Right.
Tends to be like men are convicted of it far more often. Um, what's fascinating, just related to that, 43.8% of lesbian women reported lifetime rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, compared to 35% of heterosexual women, which is kind of fascinating. So
Hmm.
women, so that just in terms of like if you're just matriarch versus matriarch, it actually increases the rates of reported violence. Now, as with all, and this has been for women and men in different eras, probably differently dominated. We speak of the socialization, the gendered socialization aspects always come in here, which is why it's fascinating as a sociological construct as well. Because men, I've talked to a lot of women about this. Women feel, because I think the public narrative allows it more, are far more ready to speak to quotidian lived experience examples of when they felt like they were dismissed because they were a woman. Whereas men, we feel like we're complaining when we're on top, kind of thing. You know, like, oh, well, we kind of live in a male dominated system. So it's like, I probably don't even know. And I also notice a lot of men don't notice these things. And I think testosterone is part of it, honestly, like hormonally, just based on, again, on lived experience of like living with someone who's super high testosterone as my stepdad, who just didn't notice social slights in the way that like I did, or women might be far more attuned to, because I feel like, again, there's a statistical prevalence of women negotiating social power at a degree of nuance higher than the average man. Hopefully I put that as carefully as possible. And that's a social trope as well as, I believe, something born about by like sociological evidence. So it's, yeah, it's pretty fascinating. And I feel like the one nice thing is people are really starting to wrangle with toxic patriarchy over the past like 5 or 6 years, um, is that men start, like, I think, feel more free by virtue of this sort of weird lemming aspect to human beings, which is, well, other people are talking about it, so I feel it's safe to talk about it too. This is sort of the Bennett pot, the positive negative of like the Me Too movement, right? Some bad apples took advantage, but largely it enabled people to go, oh, they're speaking up. They had this experience. I'm going to speak up. Like, A, I'm going to be brave about it, but B, I also don't feel so alone, which decreases the amount of bravery I need to execute in order to speak against being harmed. Um, and so in some ways it's cool. I think it's even beneficial for us to talk about the detriments for men, especially mental health, um, readiness, that sort of thing. All of which I would contend has been exacerbated by our matriarchal experiment. Because again, you look at those things that men are punished for, and it's not following the prescribed social order, like men being suspended more often. And I've noticed this too, because therapy, which has come to dominate educational paradigms, and education itself, especially grade school education, is dominated even in like the high parts of the hierarchy by women. So women have been running therapy for decades. So therapy is matriarchal, and so that means women get to establish, I would say, in one of the most, if not the most potent form of social control, which is establishing which things are seen as social mores and violations of those, especially in a culture that is like more dominantly morally relativistic, which means we rely on mores more than anything to tell us like what's okay and what's not. And we saw this gain masterful prevalence in 2020, et cetera, where women were far more likely to indict those who didn't comply with dictates, the new moral standards being projected by the expert class or whoever or whatnot. And then likewise, women are far more anti free speech, believe that you should kind of do whatever you can to suppress anything that violates normative behavior. Far more than I've ever seen men do it, which like men slightly more dominantly did it when I was a child, but I've watched over time that like men don't really seem to be the enforcers of social mores very dominantly in our society anymore. I don't know if you've noticed the same thing. So then boys get in trouble because they're quote unquote acting like boys, meaning like physical engagement, physical violence, that sort of thing is punished quite readily in schools. But verbal manipulation, emotional bullying, social ostracization, all these things are very powerful and cause long term psychological damage, are not near as regulated. And I'd say that both from statistical, like recurrence of these things being punished, but also in terms of lived experience with my own daughters, like in elementary schools, just talking to administrators about their policies, that they seem to wildly disfavor male forms of what would even be called aggression. And not all aggression is bad, plenty of aggression is good. And children have to practice aggression in order to know how to properly execute aggression in adulthood. But that female aggression is wildly unchecked, socially speaking. And I actually would say is venerated. Whereas male aggression is regulated. You look at male aggression largely, sure, we have war movies and stuff like that, right? But we have sport, like I would say male aggression is regulated through sports, which is a very comprehensively rule-based thing. Even combat sports, right? MMA, which is like, that's barbaric. And it's like, it's mostly honor-based. Not everyone treats it that way, but most people do. And that it's very rule-based. You can't do this. You mustn't do this. You can do this. You mustn't do this. But on the contrary, I would say like the Real Housewives shows are the versions of like football and MMA, and they are barely regulated. They're regulated by like who can scream the most or who gets venerated in the editing room or whatever. But female aggression is kind of treated as like, oh, look at the hijinks and silliness they're up to. And I just don't I don't see any I don't see our culture venerating like male aggression in that way or sort of celebrating it as like a trope to just be like ha, 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 about, you know. It's kind of fascinating.
No. Well, as part of the research, I just rewatched Mean Girls, where
Perfect.
obviously highlights many of the things you were just talking about.
Yeah.
Um, and more recently with my stepdaughter watching Dance Moms, uh, which is even closer
Oh, yeah,
to.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But yeah, like that's fascinating. I wonder. I don't know. I remember. I don't know, like some mixed gender reality TV, like from way back in the day. But are they mostly women oriented? Would you
I mean,
say?
a lot of those are a lot of the like quote unquote reality shows. You see sort of gender interplay, but I think the same mores are applied to things like whatever our Love Islands or Love is Blind and that sort of thing. Where like male aggression, like males start pushing each other or screaming at each other, it's very, very bad.
Uh,
But when women scream at each other or whatever, you're like, oh my, oh boy, you know, like, but all that and all the manipulation and like talking tales, people like get a little hungry about. Like gossip is venerated in our society, but violence is not. Even though they both, I mean, gossip I would actually say is more morally improper than violence is, because violence has proper use. You use violence to stop violence or protect people from danger or whatever. There's many reasons why you would need to be violent. There's almost no reason you would ever need to gossip. And so, like, just as a, and I've done this as a moral survey across all moral systems throughout history, tale bearing or whatever, serpent tonguing or whatever, all sorts of societies have different words for what it is to kind of gossip. And gossip is just like, I just think gossip is like one of the great weapons of toxic matriarchy, just like physical violence is for toxic patriarchy.
no, it's the book The Four Agreements, which I think is a strong staple of contemplation,
Yeah.
is be impeccable with your word, and he's really talking about
Hmm.
not gossiping. Um,
Yeah.
it's funny. I mentioned that once to a woman, a facilitator friend, and she was sort of defended it. It was like, well, we're down on gossiping, but that's just women who are higher sort of social animals, which in and of itself is an interesting thing to unpack because I would
Yep.
argue, like when I've been looking at this 85-year longitudinal study from Harvard where
Mm.
relationships are important for our health, maybe the most important thing. So it's like,
Yeah.
okay, so
Yeah. We're all
whether
social.
that's
Yeah.
nature or nurture, like there's a problem if we're like just saying, oh, men suck at being social. Uh, yeah, there was another thought there, but
No,
it's
that's a
moved
no, but
away.
that's another concrete example of the same thing, which is to denigrate male-centered means of social congress and to elevate women's as though women's is necessarily better. This is a very silly example, but it reminds me of it. Seinfeld, I've heard him a couple different things, like one of his comedians in cars getting coffee or whatever, and then a couple other occasions where he was adamantly disputing that women are better at decorating. And he's like, no, I make as many, if not more, decisions about like what our house looks like and what furniture we buy. And this whole trope that like women are just better at these things, better at nesting. And he's like, bullshit. This is just like that's a trope. No, they're no better than anyone else. They just get told they are, and so then they assume they are, and they kind of take that power position. Just like men might have a tendency, and I don't know if this is true or not, but like might have a tendency to be like, well, I'm going to make the financial decisions here. Now, I am low in conscientiousness, so me following systems that are required to kind of keep finances in balance is like I have no pretensions of being that man, so maybe I notice this more. Um, but yeah, it's a similar function. Again, it's this establishing of women. I would contend, especially on the left, which tends to control certain types of institutions, dominate whatever our secular morality is. So they essentially run the plutocracy or oligarchy of the quote unquote secular church in our social order, which to me is a more prevalent and systemic power that all of us interact with on a daily basis. So
Well,
I think we're in it.
yeah, and I remember what I was going to say a second ago, like you were mentioning on the reality TV shows or men maybe shunned, for using physical power, pushing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a just a bizarre contradiction there for me too, and it probably relates to what you were saying earlier, right? If well, men on average have more physical power, they cause more harm if they choose to
Yes.
use it,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, are more likely to be, I don't know, entangled with the justice system if they do, etc.
Yeah.
Um, and yet, there's a strong argument that of how important our psychological, our mental health, our social health is.
Hmm.
And yet in those cases, it's like we're shoving that to the side and saying, well, we're going to shun the overuse of physical power, but not the overuse of toxic sort of social and mental power.
Yeah. Yeah. I just think it's a less regulated archy. But to me, the reason it's less regulated is because the people who would be regulated by such systems are the ones in power. So, of course, how would they not manipulate the system to deprioritize the ways in which they violate mores? And if morals are gone, which is in many ways sort of the deconstruction of objective morality or objectivism or logic, which tend to hew a little more masculine, which maybe can draw us into the Shakti leadership, um, is openly harangued as though that's toxic, like that's white supremacy, that's patriarchy, is like veneration of those things. But those are the nice thing I think about them, which I appreciate, which is men venerating things that regulate power that they have no power over. Whereas Moors, we all have influential power over, like what society says is right and wrong. Whereas morals, you can't change. They are they pre-exist, and so you can't. Yeah, you can pretend they don't exist. You can lie about them and all that sort of thing. You can still play those power games around them. But if you can objectively or morally prove something to be wrong, then you don't get to do it whether you like it or not. Now you can do it, but you're in violation. Whereas if we don't have those things, then all we have are mores. So in any society that doesn't have them, which we increasingly don't, whoever controls the mores controls society, controls everything, because you control the social order, which we all require, right? That sense of relationship is as essential as water, shelter. That's getting towards that belonging. Um,
Absolutely. Well, since you invoked it, why don't I talk a little bit about Shakti and then we can vote.
yeah.
We forgot to do the pre-vote.
Oh, that's right.
But so this book, Shakti Leadership, was written by Neelam Abbat, a friend of mine, and Raj Sodia many years ago. Raj was one of the founders of conscious capitalism. Um, and there's a polarity map in here, which essentially means so the whole premise of this is about feminine and masculine energy,
Hmm.
which are sort of poor English translations for Shiva and Shakti from I think even they would say Indian, which feels like a pretty broad generalization for such a vast country. Um, and nevertheless, and this is kind of also woven in with conscious leadership. But I
Hmm.
always thought this polarity map was fascinating, and the idea of feminine and masculine energy means they can live in any of us, regardless of any other trait.
Yeah, yeah.
In fact, they had when I first met Neelima many years ago, she had like a little one-page assessment of sort of where you trend, and I trended way
Mm.
heavier on feminine energy.
Mm.
Um, and I'm just this interesting as I was learning about you in these conversations and us. It's like, well, we both grew up, I think, as feminists in a feminist age.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but this is basically for feminine and masculine. There's sort of positive and negative traits, and that's what it looks like.
Oh, yeah.
Um, I'll just read a couple of these just to give us a little texture. So on the feminine side, um, positive traits would include empathy, gentleness, inclusion, nurturing, openness, creativity, harmony. And on the masculine side, positive traits would include clarity, assertiveness, focus, direction, order, discipline, structure,
Mhm.
strength. The negative feminine would include smothering, sentimental. In fact, I don't know that they use positive, negative, but they're saying blind spot or excess, right? So this is
Okay.
the
Sure.
toxic part of it.
Yeah, yeah.
Smothering, sentimental, needy, dependent, exploited, unfocused, weak, manipulative. And on the uh, negative side of masculine, there's aggressive, cruel, mechanical, arrogant, insensitive, violent, power hungry, or spiritually empty. And in this model, this premise is the idea is if you ever get trapped in either negative pole,
Mm.
what you want to do is go to the opposite positive.
Hmm.
So say you're noticing you're being needy, I don't know,
Yeah.
negative feminine, then you might move to being assertive
Hmm.
or strong or something like that. So
Yeah, or just disciplined or whatever. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Well,
so there
even
you go.
even look at well, that's relatively balanced, but even look at the list is pretty hilarious. Meaning, like the male negatives seem, at least to me, maybe it's just because I'm a male, but maybe you read it differently. Seem far more obviously negative when you're like arrogant and spiritually empty. It's
Spiritual
like
envy is sort of the
like
mic
that's
drop on that whole thing. Yeah.
that's pretty intense, bro. Pretty okay, 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 okay. So I mean, to me, it's like I just want to note the but like there's a bias of outcome there, meaning like the feminine's like, oh, it's kind of not doing it that great, but men are like, when men get bad, it's destructive. Now, manipulative
But
can certainly leap into other paradigms as well, but it is fascinating. Well, and it's a weird. I don't know. I always find trying to gender things like this both helpful and unhelpful because you're like, as you well noted, like these are just semi-vague associations that may or may not have statistical relevance. Some of them certainly do, as in associated by sex or associated by gender. Um, but it is fascinating in at least echoing something we all need to recognize, which is the utility of tendencies of both genders. because we both exist and we both contribute to the literal propagation of our species, which I think is the sort of silver lining portion of growing up in a matriarchy or a feminist society, is recognizing like the duality of the human experience in, or really in that way. I mean, that is a very gender binary schematic that they pumped out, and recognizing the utility of that binary to reflect wholeness. So meaning it's really a point five point five binary yielding a oneness. I would say in the most, if that resonates with you, as the most excellent, be excellent to each other version, and to know that either one of those halves can yield like manipulation. Be right, Bill and Ted cross stitching it up, man. Be excellent to each other. But in trying to yield that outcome, the outcome would be recognition that neither side is simply more likely to be right by virtue of occupying that reproductive capacity or the associations by reproductive capacity.
I think that's very well said, and that's basically my read on it. It's like, let's not assume we have all one or the other,
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
because any of these traits can live in us. Well, let's vote.
Okay, yeah, let's vote. I'm going to vote, maybe surprisingly based on how I've been congressing here, but I think I voted similarly with patriarchy. I could be wrong. I didn't go back and double check. I'm going to vote thumbs down. Let's not smash the matriarchy, because I pretty much voted the same way. Let's not smash the patriarchy. It's not a, there's no need to smash. And hilariously, of course, smash is quite an aggressive nomenclature, because I think the
Can only think of the Hulk.
yeah, exactly. Hulk smash, puny humans. I don't think it needs to be smashed. I just think it needs to be cautiously regarded, and it needs to be fought and occasionally destroyed the same way patriarchy can, when it maintains a dominance of inequality as it does, I believe, currently, in this case producing acceleration of harm outcomes, meaning death and dismemberment. So then yes, I don't think we need to smash it. I think it has its place, and there are actually, I think there are full on times and places where you should shut up and let men lead, and there are times you should shut up and let women lead, because I don't think either one has some magic capacity to have firm and undeniable leadership in every single strata of every single decision type that needs to be made.
Yeah, yeah, I'm aligned with that. I'm also a thumbs down.
Yeah.
I think just generally, yeah, like be considerate. I think the danger of swinging one direction or the other, it sounds like we both hold, is the thing to watch out for,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So in some ways, the wrestling back and forth maybe is just how it's going to work, which is kind of a shame, right? You want to eventually find balance, um, instead of constantly pursuing like, no, everyone has to run this way. It's the and I'm a little bit like that, so I think I recognize why it's a fallacious um, attempt if you're trying to stabilize something. It's the I always use the seesaw metaphor, where I like to run, like if I'm just doing the seesaw by myself, I'm running back and forth from left to right to keep it balanced, which, shock of shocks, if anyone's ever played on a seesaw, does not yield anything approaching balance. You might eventually get equal air time for either side, so it might balance out as an average seemingly, but to actually stand in the middle and kind of lean your weight back and forth event is really the only way you're going to achieve anything resembling true balance.
Beautiful. Well, I appreciate being balanced with you.
Thanks for balancing with me,
We call
feminine
that
Andy.
love.
You do. All right.
And
Love you, Andy.
love you. Bye.
Mwah. Bye.